Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Matt Schulich. I am the virtual event coordinator for the Ohio History Connection. Just want to cover a couple of logistical things that I'm sure you guys have heard once or twice by this point. So we are set up in webinar style. We're going to keep the chat open for attendees to share comments, resources, respond to questions. Just make sure that when you type something in the Q&A that you have all panelists and attendees selected in the to field. If you have questions, be sure to drop those in the Q&A so we can see your questions as they come up. More than likely not going to be able to respond to a question in the chat, just given on how the activity might be. So be sure to drop those questions in the Q&A. And if you run into any tech issues, just email dl@ohiohistory.org. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Wendy.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the Ohio Local History Alliance annual meeting. I'm Wendy Zuppel, president of the Alliance, and I hope that everyone is experiencing a great conference. Our education committee has done a fabulous job bringing together speakers and panelists and sessions, and our keynote speaker is going to be exceptional. Without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ben Garcia, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the Ohio History Connection, to introduce our keynote speaker. And we also want to share a quick note of thanks to the Ohio Humanities Council for being the premier sponsor of this conference. So Ben?
Thank you so much, Wendy. I am so happy that we have a chance to hear from Melanie Adams today. Dr. Melanie Adams is currently serving as the director of the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum. Before joining the Smithsonian, Dr. Adams served as the deputy director for learning initiatives at the Minnesota Historical Society, overseeing the state's 26 historic sites. Prior to Minnesota, she spent 12 years at the Missouri Historical Society as the managing director for community education and events. Dr. Adams is an active member of the museum community and served on the board of the American Association for State and Local History, and is a former president of the Association of Midwest Museums. So, Dr. Adams, we are just so thrilled that you're here with us today, coming back to your Midwestern roots, and looking forward to your presentation and to our conversation after.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen here so you'll have a chance to kind of look at something other than me. Yes, there we go. And let me do one other thing here. Great. Great. Well, thank you. Sorry. Great. Well, thank you to the Ohio Local History Alliance for inviting me to talk with you about museums and the role we play in society. I must admit I wrote this talk within the past 2 weeks, not because I procrastinate, but because things are changing at such a rapid pace. I wasn't sure what the world would look like when I took the virtual stage today. Between COVID-19, the ongoing racial violence against people of color, and the deaths of beloved figures such as Chadwick Boseman and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I wasn't sure we would make it to October, but here we are. With everything happening in the world right now, it is easy to think of museums and historic sites as superfluous and something that is not essential to helping the country climb out of the holes we find ourselves in, one created by a health crisis and the other created by the systemic racism that built and maintains this country's status quo. I would argue that now is the perfect time for museums to reimagine the roles they can play in their communities and work towards creating institutions that model the work that needs to be done if society is to both learn and grow from the events of 2020. As you heard in my introduction, I have the privilege of working at the Anacostia Community Museum, one of the museums and centers within the Smithsonian Network. Compared with our colleagues on the Mall, we are a small museum, but we have a strong history that uniquely positions us to serve the community during this time of continued unrest and uncertainty. The Anacostia Community Museum was created in 1967 by then Secretary Dillon Ripley in response to the racial unrest in the country. The Smithsonian recognized that it needed to find a way to reach out to the African American community, and so they decided to place a museum off the mall and in the heart of the community in Southeast DC. When it was originally conceived, the museum was to serve as a, quote, outpost of the larger Smithsonian museums by hosting small exhibits that would drive people, specifically African Americans, to the museums on the mall. The founding director, John Kennard, had other ideas. Instead of positioning the new museum to retell the stories found at the museums on the mall, Kennard envisioned and created a museum that told the stories of African Americans and their lives in Southeast and beyond. He understood that being a community museum meant that it was their responsibility to serve the community by showcasing its history, arts, and culture. This does not mean the museum shied away from difficult topics and events, but instead they put them in context by telling stories through multiple lenses. Now, more than 50 years later, the Anacostia Community Museum continues to serve as a leader in the museum field for its groundbreaking work that centers the community and their stories. While I would love to take credit for ACM's history, I've only been in place for a year, so I can't say I'm responsible for the great work that happened before my arrival, but I can promise to build upon it. When I think about sense of urgency and risk-taking in the museum field, I would like to use examples from the entirety of my museum experiences. Before heading back east, as Ben mentioned, I spent over 20 years in the Midwest, first at the Missouri Historical Society located in St. Louis, Missouri, and then at the Minnesota Historical Society located in St. Paul, which I learned quickly was the upper Midwest, not just the Midwest. My work with my colleagues at these three institutions make up what I learned about the importance of having a sense of urgency and taking risks. These qualities help build a foundation for a museum or historic site that helps make it both valuable and relevant. When I first joined the Missouri Historical Society, I had never worked at a museum and was still trying to understand the extent of my decision-making power. One of the first things I learned was to never promise anyone an exhibit, which is of course what everyone wanted when I mentioned I worked at the Historical Society. Early during my tenure, we mounted an exhibit on the great modern dancer from East St. Louis, Katherine Dunham. As part of the gallery experience, my education coordinator wanted to include a Dunham method dance class as part of each student tour. I thought this was a great idea until I heard she wanted to have it in our grand hall. The grand hall was just that, a grand hall with nothing in it and should not be used for anything but very special occasions, much like many of our childhood living rooms, but without the plastic on the furniture. I thought about the idea and took it to my president. The president was indifferent about the sanctity of the grand hall, so I gave the idea my blessings. This was a risk for many reasons. First, we were doing a dance class as part of a tour for a history lesson. Second, we were using a space that was usually left empty during the day. And finally, we were just doing something new, and that is usually all it takes to strike fear in the hearts of administrators everywhere. I use this example because so many times people think of a risk as something more controversial than a dance class in a grand hall. Every program, exhibit, project may be a risk, and so it is important to celebrate the small steps that lead to the bigger change. I'm happy to say that the Grand Hall has since become an active program space that is now used for both school and public programs. The next example of risk-taking is more the type of risk that keeps history professionals up at night. While at the Minnesota Historical Society, I worked hard to expand the narratives related to historic Fort Snelling, including the stories of enslaved and Native American communities. For decades, the visitor experience focused on traditional military activities like firing a cannon, marching in formation, and the life of a 19th century soldier. While these activities told one story of life at the fort, It left out the lives of those who lived on the land before it was a fort, and the men and women who were brought to a free territory but served as enslaved people, including Dred and Harriet Scott. During my 3 years, I worked with staff to develop narratives and public programs that centered the stories of those who were left out of the original narrative. I invited Joseph McGill, founder of the Slave Cabin Project, to sleep in Scott's room. I also invited African-American food historian Michael Twitty to talk in our kitchen about the lives of enslaved workers, highlighting the role that the fort played in the lives of Native Americans, including the hanging of 2 Dakota elders after the War of 1862. The stories we began telling were more than the stories of manifest destiny and life on the wild frontier. And that became a problem for some of our constituents who felt that their stories were being pushed aside and forgotten. The tension came to a head when the Minnesota Senate passed a bill that reduced the funding for the Historical Society by $4 million, or 18% of our state allocation, because we wanted to add the location Bedote to the name of the historic fort. Bedote is the Dakota name for the land upon which the fort sits. This became a 6-month discussion that ended with the society receiving its entire allocation, but no real resolution over the name of the historic site. Since I left, the society set up a committee to gather community input on the best way to move forward with the name. For my final example of risk-taking, I'm going to take us back to the Missouri Historical Society, and this time we are in the LOGIA. The LOGIA of the Missouri Historical Society is home to the biggest statue of Thomas Jefferson I have ever seen. Founded in 1866, the Historical Society building is officially named the Jefferson Memorial Building and was the first site named for Jefferson west of the Mississippi. Years after the success of the Katherine Dunham program in the Grand Hall, we continued to do planned public programs in that space. Then in 2012, Trayvon Martin was shot while walking home from the store. This was the first of many young African-American men's deaths that would enter into America's consciousness and make people take to the streets for justice. The Historical Society had done programs on issues of race in the past, but not a quick response type of program that was called for in this type of situation. Working with a local online publication, the Historical Society created a pop-up digital exhibit that encouraged people to come to the museums and take their picture in a hoodie and hold up a sign answering questions such as, "Because of Trayvon Martin, I will," "To honor Trayvon Martin, I will commit to think differently about," and "This tragedy has inspired me too." These pictures were then uploaded to the publication and photo gallery that was created, showing the actions that people would take to right the wrong that was done to Martin. This type of program showed the juxtaposition of one of our founding fathers and our continued fight to prove that all men are indeed created equal. This program was a risk because it was one of the first times the museum openly responded to a current event with a sense of urgency, while emotions were still raw and historians had not had the time to put it into historical context. Instead of talking about the racial violence of the past, we spoke about the violence that happened last week. Before charges were filed, lawyers were hired, and society had determined who was the victim. It was risky doing programs in what I call, quote, real time, and I must admit a bit scary. But it was important for our organization to take the risk and step up to the challenge to serve the community when it was hurting most. As you can tell from the examples above, risk-taking and sense of urgency are usually connected in some way, and even more so given the rapid pace of information distribution. A sense of urgency goes against everything history holds dear. Historians like to have a certain amount of distance or time, usually at least 50 years, from an event in order to provide a neutral scholarly interpretation. Using this framework is why so many museums focus on the past to the detriment of the current history happening around them. Think of the types of exhibits you are likely to see at most history museums. Many of them barely make it into the 1980s, let alone the events of 2019. And my museum, the Anacostia Community Museum, is just as guilty. Our latest exhibit, A Right to the City, looks at social justice issues from the 1960s and 70s in 6 DC neighborhoods. In August of 2014, after the shooting of Michael Brown, there was a divided response in the St. Louis region. Many people took to the streets demanding justice now and changes in policing moving forward. Others didn't understand why the shooting touched off a nerve in the African American community because they didn't have the historical background to understand the context of policing in African Americans. The question I heard the most back then, mostly from white individuals, was why did this happen and why is the African American community so angry? The Missouri Historical Society had a strong reputation in the community as a place that addressed difficult issues, especially in regards to race. For almost 20 years leading up to 2014, the museum president was an active member of the community, even serving on the city's school board. His involvement allowed him to see in action the systemic racism that flowed through the city alongside the storied Mississippi River. For this reason, it was only natural for the museum to serve the community after the shooting of Michael Brown. Because, as I mentioned, the museum always dealt with these issues, there were programs already scheduled for September 2014 related to race, education, and protests. One such program was the 50th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education. The speaker was Sherilyn Eiffel, the president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. After a quick conversation, she expanded her program to include the events of Ferguson and how the lack of educational opportunities contributed to the environment that ultimately resulted in violence. While there were some programs scheduled, the museum did work with the community to develop and implement new programs to take place within weeks of the shooting. The first such program was a town hall meeting facilitated by Kevin Powell, a national activist and speaker. The museum had worked with Powell before, and he reached out wanting to do a town hall that would allow the community to come together to grieve and find strength in their shared commitment to justice. The town hall meeting was scheduled on the same day as Michael Brown's funeral and welcomed more than 400 people to the museum's Grand Hall and lasted more than 3 hours. The program was a success because the museum recognized there was a sense of urgency to create a space for the community to gather. We didn't create a committee. We didn't hold numerous meetings. We understood we understood the urgency of the moment and put our resources to good use. A more recent example of how a museum can create a sense of urgency and respond to the current moment is our online collecting initiative created by the Anacostia Community Museum. Like many of you, the Smithsonian shut its doors on March 14th and sent everyone home to continue to work through the pandemic. After the initial shock of the situation, ACM staff came together to figure out what we could do in this moment to continue to serve our community remotely. The idea of Moments of Resilience was born. Moments of Resilience is based on the idea that the Southeast community is used to hard times and we've always found a way to be resilient. We asked people to share stories of how they were being resilient. Originally thinking we would get stories from the DC region, we were pleasantly surprised and delighted to receive stories from all over the country. People talked about new ways they were celebrating marriages and graduations. They talked about how they were getting to know their neighbors and their neighborhoods. They expressed gratitude for the many essential workers that remained on the job so they could continue to shop for groceries and receive packages. They showed that even though we were in the middle of a national health crisis, people were finding ways to make it through. After the killing of George Floyd by the Minneapolis Police Department, we expanded Moments of Resilience to include stories of how people are being resilient in regards to the racial unrest that is taking place on America's streets. We received stories of how people marched as a form of protest, made protest signs, and how others came together to feed the protesters. We are still collecting stories for the foreseeable future. As long as people have stories to share, we will continue to serve as a space that amplifies their voices. As I come to the end of my talk, I would like to provide some concrete things you can do on Monday when you return to your offices, either at home or on site, to begin moving towards creating institutions that take risks and begin to cultivate a sense of urgency. The first thing is to get to know your community and its issues and needs. What is a risky topic in one community may not be a risk in another. What is relevant in one community may not be relevant in another. As you get to know your community, create opportunities for sustained engagement and not one and done exhibits and programs that serve to satisfy your checklist. During the AASLH conference earlier this week, a panelist compared community engagement to donor cultivation. She said, "We spend months cultivating donors to gain their trust, making at least 6 contacts or impressions before making a financial ask. When it comes to community groups, we expect to walk away with a solid partnership after one meeting, usually in our space and over some cookies." While we aren't asking community partners for money, we are asking for their trust and should put the effort and time it takes to gain it. Second, take an honest assessment of your organization, both internally and externally, to determine where you are on a journey towards taking more risks and creating a sense of urgency. Some organizations may want to jump right in and begin tackling every issue that is brought to your doorstep. I would suggest that you address issues that are most relevant to both the community and your organization, and don't try to please everyone. If your organization has not yet reached out to your community, you can begin with little steps, such as allowing community organizations to host meetings in your space free of charge. When I do this, I require that the organization allow a museum staff person to welcome them and speak for a few minutes. This becomes the first interaction with the group that can then lay the groundwork for a follow-up call or meeting. Finally, I would like to suggest that every museum and historic site take a look at their mission, vision, policies, and procedures to see if there are roadblocks to taking risks and creating a sense of urgency. Many of the best ideas don't even get off the ground because they're mirrored in red tape designed to protect the organization, not help it live out its mission and vision. As the dual pandemics continue to impact our country, now is the time to have the discussions about who you want to be and the role you want to play in our country's reemergence. Your mission and vision should serve as a roadmap, not only to where you want to take your organization, but the type of world you want your organization to help create. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions.
Thanks so much, Melanie. That's a great way to start off this conversation about risk-taking and really just generally about how we move forward in this moment, where what used to be, what used to be activities or messages or ideas that were considered relatively neutral are now so highly politicized, right?
Yes.
I have a couple of questions for you. You've had the chance to work in organizations of different sizes at this point. And can you talk a little bit about, although Anacostia is associated with an enormous organization, it probably, to what degree does it function as a small museum? And to what degree do you feel like the leeway is different, the ability to flex and deal with urgency or risk changes based on the size of the institution that you're in?
Right, and I think, that is a really good point, and that's one of the reasons why I was excited to join the Anacostia Community Museum, because I feel like it's the best of both worlds. I'm a small museum, but I'm in a larger structure, so I have the support of the Smithsonian, but we are really able to respond to the community in the ways that we see fit, and I think a lot of that is because of how we were founded. So if you think about our founding, we were founded exactly during a moment such as this. And so I think as community museums around the country were founded during the 1960s, they really were designed to serve the community and respond to the needs of the community. I think what happens with larger organizations, and even sometimes a little bit with little ones, is you're trying to be all things to all people. And I think that's why at the end, I really mentioned your mission and vision, which is so critical in guiding you on who your constituencies are and who you really should be serving. So I think the size of your organization should not be a barrier to serving your community. And again, looking at what red tape did you put in place? Because so many times staff would come to me and say, oh, well, I know we can't do this, but, and I'm like, you've already talked yourself out of the idea. How do you know we can't do it? So really having that open mind, regardless the size of your organization, to not put up barriers to doing great work.
That's great. I mean, as I think about the constituency here for the Ohio Local History Association, you do have a number of folks who are working in large organizations or in organizations like the Ohio History Connection that have associations with many sites, but most are working in much smaller organizations. And so, do you have any sort of words of advice for them about how they might take advantage of this idea of risk and urgency, given the fact that that many of them are working with smaller organizations?
Right. I think this is a great opportunity for partnerships. Because as you've mentioned, a lot of our smaller historic sites and museums may be the only one in their town that deals with the town's history. So I know what I did a lot in Missouri was really look for like-minded organizations to partner with. So that usually didn't mean I was partnering with other history organizations just because we were usually the only one, but there were so many other organizations that were, that complemented our mission. So whether it was anything like the Boys and Girls Club, scouting was always really big, to a food pantry. One of the things that people always say is museums are not social service agencies, which I totally agree with, but that doesn't mean we can't partner with social service agencies or we can't partner with organizations. So I think a lot of our smaller museums throughout the country really should look at who in their community is wanting to do very similar work and wanting to create similar outcomes, and can they partner with those organizations to find ways to work together?
Yeah, that's great. The lens through which you're talking to us today is really that sort of understanding how taking risks can serve the community, and that, it seems like a premise is that one of our obligations as museums is to take the risk, get out of our own way, because communities need something different from us. So I think that sort of pokes at the bigger question of what is the role of museums today, understanding that sort of the kinds of challenges that we're dealing with globally and here in the United States, they require an awful lot from a lot of different kinds of organizations. And I don't know that museums would be on that sort of high on the list of the kinds of organizations that people are thinking about that need to respond to this moment. What do you feel like the role of museums should be right now, given the sort of societal issues that we're dealing with, whether it's the pandemic or this moment of really pushing at the question of racial justice in the country?
Right, and I think pre-pandemic, I probably would have had a different answer than post-pandemic. And I think really what this pandemic has shown us is exactly what I'm talking about around the sense of urgency. Because I feel like a lot of museums had started tiptoeing into some of this work around issues of relevancy and rapid response. And I think the pandemic just kind of blew everything up in terms of the sense of urgency to not only have discussions about it, but more importantly, start moving towards solutions. And so I think where museums can really help play this role is, first of all, you have to know you have to know what are your strengths and what are your limitations. So as I mentioned in my talk, you know, not every museum is at the same place. So you have to figure out where are you in having these types of discussions? What is your credibility within the community to have these types of discussions, and kind of take it from there. So usually the first thing I do is an assessment of the organization and your resources. So what do you have? What does the community need? And how can you then begin to share those? But I think you will see more people pushing back on museums and historic sites in terms of interpretation, and are they providing a diverse narrative? And unfortunately, so many think of that as revisionist history, which it's not, because stories have been told from one perspective, and they've usually been from the perspective of the winner or the white male perspective. And so really what visitors are now coming to us for is, I know that can't be the only side of the story. So where are the other sides of the story? And we're getting a more educated consumer, in the sense of they understand nuance. They understand things aren't black and white. So I think it's our job to really help people begin to see that. And again, as I mentioned in my comments, it's also important for us to explain to them that history is happening all around them all the time. So, you know, when you go to a historic site, it's so easy to see something from, you know, the 19th, 20th century, but we're not talking about the history that's happening in our community right now, which is one of the ways that you leave out the communities of color, because you have a lot of newer immigrant communities moving in who haven't been here for 50 years. So you're not telling their stories. So I think what we can do is we can really help this country move forward to be able to tell the true stories of our history, how we were founded, why we were founded, and how can we work together to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really great. I mean, I think you're sort of getting that issue of sort of additive, you know, versus subtractive, or, you know, I mean, as we think about space, whether it's physical space or programmatic space or publication space, you know, it seems like what you're pointing to, and that you know, what I think about a lot is there's a lot to be added. This is largely an additive process.
Mm-hmm.
It's about just shifting that lens a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left, to see who else was in this story other than the individuals that lens is currently focused on, based on sort of historical practice, museum practice of the last 100 years. Can you sort of, you know, as someone who is, you know, thinking strategically and pragmatically about how you meet people in communities where they are and bring them, hopefully to understand some new things about the histories of the communities that they're in, or even new things about their current day communities and situations. How do you think about that balance between additive and corrective or subtractive?
Right. And I think the way I think about it is you have to give people multiple avenues into the content or into your organization, because no one wants to feel like there was a bait and switch. People always want to have an option. And so you're finding, as historic sites around the country are adding more diverse content, some people are really excited about that idea, and others will say, you know, I came to this plantation to learn about the curtains on the wall. I didn't come to hear about the enslaved workers. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really important to give people the options, but I also think it's important to integrate the stories. Like, that's one of the things I sometimes see some places doing a little wrong, is they'll create a whole separate tour, like a separate women's tour, a separate tour of enslaved, a separate, versus trying to show how all of those stories are integrated. And I think that way people would be more willing to listen and hear them, because they see how all of the stories make up the whole, versus just focusing on singular stories. And I think a great example from Missouri was, when I was there, we did an amazing exhibit on the Louisiana Purchase. So it was the first time all of the documents associated with the Louisiana Purchase were in one place. And so when you go to an exhibit on the Louisiana Purchase, you think you're going to hear about Thomas Jefferson, the great man, and everything great that happened with the Louisiana Purchase, which there were some great things. But the way the exhibit was positioned was, it talked about the people who the Louisiana Purchase was not that great for. So the exhibit focused on enslaved African Americans, women, and the indigenous populations, because those were the three groups that lost out under the Louisiana Purchase. So it was taking a very traditional topic that you thought you knew something about and was showing you other perspectives of it. But it wasn't done in a way where you felt like the original story you were told. We weren't saying the original story was wrong, because I think a lot of times people make the assumption that when you're adding diverse narrative, you're saying the other story was wrong. And we're not saying it's wrong, we're just saying it wasn't the whole story.
You know, it seems like, you know, through your talk, you're really talking about a responsibility that museums have during confusing times, times of uprising, times of conflict, you know, as sort of one moment where risk-taking would potentially pay off really well. As you think about that sort of thought about like our responsibility as organizations, our responsibility to our communities, can you just sort of talk a little bit more about how you think about that? What is it, you know, what kind of public value, what is it that we're responsible to do given the resources we hold and the platform that we have?
Right. And I think, you know, to quote the Smithsonian Secretary, Lonnie Bunch, you know, museums are not community centers, but we should be at the center of the community. So how are we adding value to the life of the community? How are we seen as the place? You know, that's one of the things that I think was so phenomenal about our work in Missouri, is that we were seen as the place that people wanted to go to have these conversations. And so it is really laying down that groundwork. It's similar to what happened after George Floyd, and you had all of these museums putting out statements. And some of the statements rang untrue because those organizations had not done the work. That doesn't mean that they were disingenuous. That doesn't mean their hearts weren't in the right place. But in order to put out a statement, you have to have something to back it up. So you either have to, you know, have been doing this work, or you have to promise to do the work in the future. And so I think museums really need to work with their community and figure out what are the community needs. Because as I mentioned, not every community has the same types of issues. So when I was in St. Louis, it was very much a racial dichotomy between African Americans and whites. When I moved to Minnesota, very different dichotomy. It's between Native Americans and whites. So just knowing your community is what's really important in terms of knowing how you can best serve them. And most importantly, talk to them, ask them. I think, you know, some of the most successful programs are when you're getting outside of your walls. So don't always ask everyone to come to you, but can you partner with your local library and do a small exhibit there? Like, are there other ways you can make sure you're taking your content out to your community and not expecting everyone to just come to you?
Great, I am gonna thank you, and I'm gonna shift now to bring in some questions from
Sure.
The people who are participating on this in this program. So here's one. How do you navigate through potential and likely backlash from board members, donors, staff, and the community when it comes to dealing with current and controversial issues?
Right, and I think that's really important. Part of the way I've been able to navigate it is we've just had a really good track record. So your first few times, it will be hard. Your board has to trust that you have the professionalism in to be able to do these types of programs. But one of the things I always say, especially when it comes to programs related to dialogue and conversation, it's important to hire a trained facilitator. Like, I think I'm good, but I still hire a trained facilitator. I don't facilitate my own programs. So it's really important to know what is your skill set, because I think, as you've mentioned, the success of the program will just help build upon your board, your director, who's ever having some questions about the topic. I also think it's important to really figure out who in the community has the credibility. And again, that's a great way to partner. So if there are organizations within your community who do this work and you want to start doing it, can you partner with them to begin getting the trust? And I have to say, there will always be board members or people who complain. Like, there hasn't been a program I've done where people haven't had complaints. And I think what's important is listening to people, so hearing their complaints. But one of the things that used to frustrate me, especially as a professional of color, is that we were always so concerned about our white constituencies who complained. And I said, just once, I wish you cared as much about the people of color who may be complaining, because it's not like we weren't complaining about maybe certain interpretation, but our voices were never brought to the forefront the same way white individuals' concerns were brought front if we did a Black Lives Matter program. So just really kind of think about that as you're deciding whose voices you're bringing forward for the complaints as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Jason Crable asked if you could talk a little bit more about how the work that you did in Missouri with communities around St. Louis in the years before 2014 impacted the work that you were able to do to help the community heal following Michael Brown's murder.
Right. Well, we had really laid the groundwork. We had a really strong African-American program series. We were doing exhibits related to African-American history and culture throughout. It was never kind of just a checking off the box. One of the great programs we did around that time was we brought the race exhibit, Are We So Different?, which it was interesting because another organization in town had passed on it because they thought it was too political. So it goes to Ben's point of what all of a sudden became political and what didn't. But we'd spent almost a good 10 years, probably more than that, laying the groundwork. But I do want to emphasize the importance of leadership. So during my time there, my president, he was so involved in the community. They understood that the work we were doing was authentic and grew out of his interactions with the community. He lived in the city, he was on the school board. So that is also really important. And one of the things I usually like to emphasize with my staff is I encourage them to join community organizations. And I would give them work time to do that. So yes, be on the Boy Scout board, be in this community group, because that is the best way to kind of expand your network and to have connections into those organizations. So you want to have your staff very involved with the community, because again, that shows that you're authentic in creating these partnerships.
Yeah, that's great. And Andy Verhoff asked what would you recommend? What could a lone board member or a small group of trustees do to encourage a local museum to think big and take risks? What would you recommend sort of that first step that they could take when they go to their next board meeting might be?
Any director would love to have their board say, what could you do to take risks? I think that would just open up the conversation, because I feel like so many times we think our board is the ones holding us back. And we haven't even had the discussion with our board. Our board may not know we want to do these things. So the board is not holding us back. We're holding ourselves back. So I think for a board to come to a director and say, what can we do to create a sense of urgency? They would be like, yes, I am all about that and I'm ready to make that happen. Because I think the board really needs to be there to support the director, the staff, as you said, when those calls come in about a program they may be doing. The board needs to understand where this is fit into the organization's mission and vision, and more importantly, how is this moving it forward? I think one of the things that these past 6 months of COVID has really taught me is I'm really focusing on our museum's vision. I mean, our mission is wonderful as well, but I look at it as our mission is what we're doing. Our vision is what we want to create in the world. And for our vision, it's create a more equitable society. So I'm focusing on the create a more equitable society right now. And so I think it's important, one of the first things you can talk with your board about is, what is your mission and vision? And no one would blame you for tweaking it right now or all out changing it based on what's happened during the pandemic. So having those discussions with your board, I think any director would love for that to happen.
Mm-hmm. That's great, thank you. As you know, thinking a little bit about what you're talking about, yeah, and that question about boards really makes me think about sort of that walking the talk or Yeah.
Talking the talk, walking the walk.
Walking the talk, walking
Yes.
the walk. And so what can you say about sort of the institutions that you've been in, you know, the relationship of the ways in which equity manifests internally versus the way that you're sort of working externally to try to be a driver toward that manifesting outside of its walls? Like, you know, have you had more success in institutions where that was happening internally first or concurrently, or, you know, what's the relation? Can one push the other? What's your experience there?
And I think, and that's a great question, because one of the things I always say, museums are still institutions and they have their racial issues. So I don't want people to think that, you know, Missouri, Minnesota, even ACM, that anywhere is a panacea and there are no racial issues that happen. And so I think what happens is so many organizations focus on the external at the expense of the internal. So I think at every organization I've been, we have tried to do the internal work, but I think it's also so fraught and everyone has to be in a place to hear it. And I really think, again, post-pandemic, more people are going to be in a place to hear it because people are pushing back, just like they did with the statements. You can't make a statement about racial equity when the majority of your staff of color is the housekeeping staff and the facilities staff. Like, what does that say? And so I think we're getting called to task more to be less, not less external, but to have the two of them match. So I think, you know, the organizations I've worked at really have been trying to figure out kind of what is that mix? How do you create those safe spaces within the organization? One thing I will say that really impressed me that we did in Missouri right after Mike Brown was the indictment came down on a Monday in November. And the DA decided to do it at like 8 o'clock at night for some reason. And, you know, so we're all watching that and everyone's just fraught because he didn't get, the grand jury didn't indict him. We actually, the board and the president at the time closed the museum the next day. Like, they recognized that no one was in a place to work on whatever we were working on. Everyone just needed that time. So I was really impressed with that decision, and really was one of the first times I saw someone do something like that. Mm-hmm. So I think that's another way that boards and, you know, directors and presidents can really support their staff in that way.
Yeah, that's great. Another question that came from, at this time, Emily R. So many rural communities in Ohio may not have as robust a racially diverse history as more urban areas. How can we go about researching and uncovering those histories of color in our majority white communities? And I guess I would piggyback on that to just sort of talk more broadly about how much does context, you know, community context and demographics impact the, you know, what risk-taking, what equity, what uncovering, you know, sort of additive history looks like.
Right, and it might not be race in your community.
Mm-hmm.
It could be LGBTQ issues. It could be women. So you don't, if you don't have a large racial history, it may not be something you need to look for, or it may be a reason. You know, I have a friend who's doing a project on sundown towns. And so, you know, she was learning that the reason why they have all white communities was because of sundown towns. So there might be a reason why there aren't any people of color in your community, but that's not the only lens from which to tell your story. Again, as you're doing the research, you might find other stories that add to the narrative that aren't tied to race, but could be tied to gender, sexuality, other things that would help round out the story. So I think that's really important. Because even when I look at Minnesota, Minnesota does not have large populations of people of color outside of the Twin Cities. And Missouri and Minnesota had 26 historic sites. So when you're looking at other sites, we had to look at other stories that we could tell. So for example, the Lindbergh House, we weren't really telling a racialized story there, but you were talking about kind of how Lindbergh was portrayed, but then also his ties to the Nazi Party. So controversy isn't always race. You know, that was the controversy when we were talking about that site. So you can kind of broaden what you think about when you think about the additive, as Ben said, the additive narratives and what makes sense for the stories you have to tell.
Yeah. I think, you know, that point that, you know, the way that our country was founded, came to be, means that inherently histories of indigenous people, histories of Black people, histories of people of color generally, and, you know, there's an ongoing responsibility to center those and to add them into the fray. But there are lots of other histories that still resonate with the concept of equity, right? Like that's economic equity,
Right.
whether that's sort of prejudice based on regionalism. I think about an exhibit down at Campus Martius in Marietta about the migration of Appalachian Americans into Ohio for economic opportunities and the kinds of prejudice and pushback that they faced. And so I do think, you know, to your point that there is a particular responsibility to provide context around what is going on in the country today and what the roots of that are in terms of the push for racial justice. But there are stories of inequity and of resilience that can be told in every community, to your point. And it's not always going to be a story of an indigenous person or a person of color. There are lots to be told, and those are also not centered, right, currently.
Right. And I don't think, you know, I don't want people to think we're trying to use history to tell everything that's bad about our country. That's not the point of history at all. But you also have to think about how we were taught history and from whose perspective. Because I remember a constituent said, well, do you want little white kids to feel bad about their history? And I must admit, I was a little flip, and I was like, well, little Black kids have always felt bad about their history based on how you've taught it. So again, let's figure this out. But, you know, if you think about how and why history is taught, I think it explains why we are where we are right now. And so I always say, I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad, but everyone wants to see themselves in history. Not everything everyone did was great. Not everything everyone did was bad, but everyone should be able to see themselves in the history.
Yeah, that's great. All right, let's see. We've got, how have you answered concerns from board members who worry about alienating donors?
Yeah,
have you personally encountered that? Have it, you know, trustees that are worried about the economic repercussions of taking a risk?
No, I haven't run into that. You know, I think, you know, most of the development people I've worked with are savvy enough to be vague. So, you know, so they're not, you know, you're not providing the donor with the exhibit script, you are giving them the broad brushstrokes. But usually the type of donors who were attracted to the programs and sites that I worked understood what we were doing. And I almost feel like it's an opportunity even more so because so many people want to contribute to a more diverse history. So I've never had a program shut down because a donor felt that it was to this or to that. That's never been an issue.
Yeah, well, yeah, so I think, you know, thinking about sort of this question, I think that sort of leads to two possibilities. One is, I think we assume that there will be pushback.
Right.
You know, those of us who are in leadership roles will often make assumptions about what our trustees will or will not support or our donors will not support. And so there's a lot of gatekeeping that we do on their behalf and we don't check it out, right? Mm-hmm. That's sort of one part of it. And the other part is there certainly are trustees or donors who will withhold support or drop support. And, you know, we dealt with that in San Diego, certainly, when we, you know, when we were moving toward a different position in relationship to racial justice and to and to Indigenous rights. And we did lose some families that were long-standing donors to the organization. And I guess what I would say is that the role of the leader in an organization is to make sure that you are connecting with the people who share a vision for why equity matters, why risk matters, why it's going to be important for us to sort of let go of some of the control and let some things just happen, right? So.
Right. And also I think, which donors to put which types of programs in front of. This is a process. So no one is kind of turning their museum. It's not like you turn a switch and one day you're one way, the next day you're another. This really is a process over time where you're bringing along your staff, your board, and your community. So as Ben said, you may lose some funders, but at the same time, you may gain some. And I think, the experience I spoke about in Minnesota was definitely one of those ones where, they threatened to take $4 million, which was about 80 staff positions. I mean, it was a little bit of a mess trying to figure that out. At the end of the day, it was okay, but that's still 6 months of trying to have those conversations on almost a weekly basis with constituents around what the work we were trying to do. And I would say one of the biggest things I learned during that situation was communication. I think really what happened was we were not always, as Ben was saying, being as transparent as we could have and should have been. And I think you can avoid some of those types of things by just having the lines of communication open early and often.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so I think we're coming to the close of our time. And so to, wrap this up, I thought maybe I would ask you a couple of slightly more personal questions related to your trajectory. So
sure.
Why museums, Melanie?
Why museums?
Museums?
I started my career in higher education student affairs. And so I was the person who did student activities and residential life. And one of the things I noticed I really liked on the student activities side was working with communities and student groups and planning programs. And I was a African American studies major in undergrad. All of my work has been kind of around history. And so this was really a natural progression. And I came into the museum side on the community-based program. So I was brought on as a consultant first to looking at expanding our reach into the community. So it was just kind of this natural connection. And I really love the work. And I feel like there's nothing but opportunity is the way I always like to think about it in museums.
That's great. And who is a museum leader or a figure that inspires you, that inspired you, if they're with us, or that inspires you in your work?
Oh my God, that's a hard one. I would have to say probably my former boss, Dr. Robert Archibald, who actually brought me into this work. And I say that because the conversations we're having now, he wrote books about this 30 years ago. He wrote about the museum being a third space. He wrote about how we should be at the center of the community, and just the work he did in Missouri really laid the groundwork then for the work that we were able to do together moving forward. So I think just every time I hear people having these conversations, I'm like, yeah, Bob talked about that 30 years ago. So it goes to show me that there's not very much that's new, but I really think that he took a lot of risks, especially being in St. Louis, and I really admired that.
That's great. All right, one more. Aside from the museums that you've worked at.
Oh God.
3 museums that you feel are unmissable for the folks who are watching this.
Oh God. Okay. The first one I'm going to say is Lincoln's Cottage. And I say that, when I went there, I'm like, I know everything I need to know about Lincoln. I knew nothing about Lincoln. I mean, it was utterly amazing, like to hear, I always like to hear the person behind the story or the person behind. And so Lincoln's Cottage does such an amazing job with empathy and just everything about it. So that would be my first one. I think my second one would have to be Eastern State Penitentiary, just because the relevant nature of the work they're doing around mass incarceration is, I think, so important right now. And it shows how a museum can really work around a relevant topic. And I think my third one, what would be my third one? I'm going to go with the Whitney Plantation, which I had a chance to visit during AAM, and that was on my list. And the Whitney Plantation is one of the few, if not only, plantations that actually tells the story of the plantation through the eyes of the enslaved workers. So there is no big house tour, there are no drapes, there's none of that. It really does talk about the hard life of harvesting sugar. And so I think those are my three unmissable places.
That's awesome. All right. Well, I think that we have exhausted the questions from our participants, and I could keep asking you these nerdy insider museum questions all day. Maybe that needs to be our next session. But we're just so grateful, Melanie, Dr. Adams, for you coming along and spending some time with us today, talking to us a bit about the work that you've done in your various institutions. And we look forward to seeing the work ahead at Anacostia to see what you and the staff there bring forward. So thank you so much for your time with us. And I think Wendy Zuckel is gonna wrap up with some announcements and other points of business.
Great. Well, thank you. And I was so looking forward to coming to Ohio. So hopefully sometime in the near future.
We look forward to it.
We'd love to have you. Ben and Melanie, thank you for a very interesting presentation and discussion. It was very interesting. Thank you so much. Just a couple announcements. We do want to recognize once again our premier conference sponsor, which is the Ohio Humanities. We appreciate their support. Pat, I think you have sat in on this program, so many words of thanks to you for supporting us. Couple announcements. There is an Alliance members group on Facebook, if you didn't know this, and we encourage our members to use it as a place for discussion and sharing experiences in between our annual and regional meetings. And Mary Manning, who does a great job with our Facebook, has asked that if you would, there's questions about your organization, if you'd answer them when joining, that'd be very helpful to her. And last but not least, I think everybody's gonna need some time to relax today, and tonight from 5 to 6, we have an evening meet and mingle, and the theme is History Heroes. Our illustrious facilitators, Christy Davis and Melissa Shaw, are encouraging you to dress up as your favorite history hero and decompress after a long day of learning all kinds of information and enjoy the evening. So don't forget that from 5 to 6. And I believe that concludes our program. Thank you again, Melanie and Ben, and we look forward to seeing you in Ohio soon, Melanie. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.